All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending where you are. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rafael Zanata. I'm the Director of Data Privacy Brazil Research Association, and welcome to the workshop Regulation Made in China. We're very thrilled and pleased to have a very group people, a set of people here with us, and I'm really excited to also introduce a hard topic. It's usually we do not discuss so much what is going on in China in the Brazilian community. And we also ask you sorry for not providing translation for this conversation, but it will be recorded. We will include some subtitles later on, but we will conduct in English because we have here Graham Webster, who will provide a keynote speak in the beginning. I will present everyone. So Graham is a research scholar at Stanford Cyber Policy Center, where he leads the Digi China project. We'll talk a little bit more about Digi China later on. We're very happy to have Sophia Shang here. Sophia is a Privacy and Data Protection Counsel. She works for FGV Law School Center for Technology and Society. We will have also Parsival, who did not enter yet, but he will join us. And Parsival is also a founder and director of Andrés Bello Foundation and the China Latin American Research Center. We also have on our side here Lucas Tasqueto, who is a project leader on this project on China. Lucas is also professor of international relations at the Federal University of ABC in São Paulo. So we thought about having this conversation with this phenomenon of the growing influence of China in the regulation of technology. We all know that there are some famous cases of a Chinese approach on regulation, such as the regulation of gaming behavior of users, or more recently, we had a lot of news about the regulation of platforms or influencers on TikTok or other big platforms, avoiding like extravagant lifestyles and other commitments of behavior that the Chinese government is asking, but also interesting phenomenon of a reinvention of the civil law and also the data protection law with more advanced and comprehensive approach of what constitutes personal data, also includes sensitive data, financial data as a category of sensitive data, and many other examples of this Chinese approach of regulation. We have a limited experience in researching about China. This is something that we are all learning and through the process. And I must say, just at the beginning, that we have 2 points of entry, so to speak, to this debate. First was the opportunity we had to collaborate with the Doublethink Lab Institute and the China in the World project, which was a more comprehensive and regional research about the growing influence of China in many countries. And it was a more like a quantitative analysis trying to reduce the complexities of some indicators to provide a general scoring and a mapping of this kind of influence. And this was a project that was conducted by one organization that is based in Taiwan, in which we collaborated as a research partner. And more recently, we obtained a fund from this China in the World program, a community fund, to do a small and exploratory research about indirect or direct influences of China in the regulation of technology in Brazil, in which Lucas will present some results, and we will discuss some of these initial findings with Sophia, with Parsival, and Graham. So this is basically the structure of the meeting today. We will begin with the keynote by Graham Webster, and I will talk a little bit about his project and Digi China, which is truly amazing. So I ask you all who are watching to also jump into the website of the Digi China, so you can learn a little more about what is going on there. It's a massive project with many people. Graham also is a journalist and researcher and is doing some great job. And we invited him to somehow provide a keynote speak so we can learn from a more comprehensive perspective and from someone who is doing field work and translating a lot of documents and having meaningful conversations with many other researchers of what is going on. And I think this will be very important to also demystify some of the arguments that we usually find here in Brazil about China. There are a lot of prejudice and a lot of misunderstanding as well about what is going on in China. A deep ideological conflict also going on right now, especially in the period of elections that we are entering in Brazil. So it is extremely important to have a more scientifically grounded conversation based on facts and on solid research. And that's why we're really, really pleased to have Graham here. So I will stop here and pass the floor to Graham so we can begin. And later on, I can provide more explanations about the project we're doing and also introduce the research with Lucas. So thanks, and it's with you, Graham.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me and for that kind introduction. For the context of people who are listening in, I'll just say a couple words about what DigiChina does so you know where I'm coming from, and then I have a few notes that I thought I'd share about how I try to look at the questions of Chinese influence or effect or on regulation around the world. And it really is a very early area of research, I believe. And I'll talk a little bit about why. But at this stage, I think both the research being presented today and the program of research shared by many researchers across the world is really just getting going to truly understand the role of Chinese tech policy and its role in the way that policy develops around the world. So DigiChina, it's a team effort. We're just about 5 years into this project, and there's a whole network of people who generally volunteer their time to translate and explain Chinese digital policy to the English reading world. And this is really, we've had a great deal of interaction with people in business, people in various governments, journalists, academic researchers. And the basic purpose is to unlock some of the available insight and information that's in Chinese and to put it in context, because even a translation alone will not cut it if you want to understand what's going on in China, if you don't yourself have also a background in the Chinese political system, which is unfamiliar to most people outside China. So, you know, I just wanted to start with, I was, and thank you all for joining us in English. I do not have the ability to join in Portuguese, unfortunately, but I was able to read a little bit of a preview of the research that'll be presented later. And I just want to initially say a couple of things about that without stealing too much thunder. I think this is it's a really rare opportunity in the world so far to see a truly careful and empirically based study looking at different methods and different indicators of Chinese influences and effects on policy. It's not a vague or, you know, sort of speculative research project, although it is just beginning. And I'm really optimistic about this approach, and I think people will have a lot to learn from. The one thing that I was struck by in the portion that I was able to review was that one of the methods used is to look at discourse in news coverage. And in that news coverage in Brazil, one of the notes in there is that about a third of the articles seem to be either translations of or re-reporting of or otherwise influenced by international media, largely Western media stories having to do with China and tech and influence. And I've seen this phenomenon before. Years ago, I was researching Japanese ideas about cybersecurity and China, and I found that a great deal of the media coverage and even Japanese government statements seem to be reflecting the news agenda coming out of Washington. That indicates that there's an international agenda setting and securitization trend, and essentially what happens in Washington or Brussels or other major media noise environments has a huge effect around the world. And frankly, I think this can be good and it can be bad. If the people in these agenda setting media storms have good ideas, if they're concerned about the right security, human rights, regulatory risks, then that's great. It's important that people in other countries who maybe don't already have a very active public discussion about China in these ways, can become aware because of the international discussion. On the other hand, if the global discussion is too influenced by the particular security or geopolitical or business views or concerns of a small number of countries, that can bring discussions to the rest of the world that aren't really relevant and don't necessarily address the specific concerns that peoples in other countries should be worried about for their own interests and reasons. And so I think this is a great example of research that puts the issue in Brazil in specific, and I look forward to learning more from it. Of course, here I am talking about Western discourse and influence, and I'm the American guy talking in the panel about a Brazilian research report. I'm self-conscious about this. But I think it's important that we keep these lines open, and it's crucial and rare for the American policy audience to listen to research coming out of other parts of the world, because I think we're seeing here and in the beginning of this global China research trend in digital policy, that there is very diverse effects in terms of Chinese roles around the world. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes now just talking about a few ways in which we can ask different types of questions about China's role in digital policy making around the world. If you look at the sort of dominant Western discourse, or US discourse especially, there's sort of a lot of very vague concerns, and some of them are quite reasonable and some of them perhaps aren't, but they are often pretty general. I'm going to try to drill down on a few of them. But throughout, I want to start with one framing question, which I always use when analyzing the effects or influence of Chinese government, the Chinese market, or other Chinese actors in the tech area. And one is, if there's a social or security problem that we're concerned about, how much of this is a technology problem? This isn't even the China question yet. When we look at human rights abuses in China that are facilitated by surveillance technology, it's analytically important to keep straight and to keep asking how much of this human rights problem is the technology and how much is the Chinese government's basic policy that could be accomplished with different technological capabilities. The second question, looking around the world, is how much of the problem that is being discussed is a China problem. Sometimes when we're observing around the world, we can observe again, I'll use the example of surveillance technology diffusing. This can look like a China problem if the Chinese company is the vendor, and if the practices that are diffusing around the world are very similar to those that are happening inside of China. But at the same time, there's an element of the pull factor. Certain governments simply want more surveillance technology, and this happens in both relatively democratic and relatively authoritarian contexts. And so it's important at each moment to consider how much of the given problem is a technology problem and how much is a China problem. And the implication here is that sometimes the concern that will come out in a public discussion attached in our minds and in our rhetoric to China is not necessarily all that much about China. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. We just have to be careful. And the reason is only if we're careful about this can reasonable solutions be charted out. Okay, so the last, I have about 10 minutes left in my allotment here. And I wanted to talk about 4 different ways in brief that I think we can start asking and continue to ask. Some of this research is well underway and some is not, but ways we can ask about the role of China in international tech policy making and regulation. So there's 4 of them. Regulation, just the regulations themselves. Then there's technical standards. Then there's the specific affordances, technological capabilities of technological vendors. And finally, there's areas in which China is an early mover in regulation. So it's sort of related to the first topic, but I'll go through these one by one. First is in regulation itself. China today has reached a level of consolidation in its digital policy making that is really remarkable compared to 10 years ago. In 2017, the cybersecurity law of China went into effect. This led to years of developing, implementing regulations and standards and other regulatory documents that build out the regime around the use of digital technology and of the internet. Last year, 2 new laws, the data security law and the personal information protection law, went into effect, adding yet more of an overall framework, both on national security issues regarding data and on protecting individuals' personal data primarily in the private sector. So the question is, are these models essentially diffusing around the world? And I think there are ways that we can look at individual pieces, but this is generally going to be a fairly complex question to investigate. In Vietnam, it does appear that the cybersecurity law of Vietnam is heavily influenced by the cybersecurity law of China. But how does this actually work in reality? This needs to be analyzed in the empirics. And I think the personal information protection law in China is a good example of ways in which influence can come into China and perhaps may leave China. But whatever happens when there's a regulatory influence or diffusion, it will be affected by the context of the local country. So the personal information protection law, basically China's main data privacy law, is heavily influenced by the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, from Europe. It's not exactly the same, but basic notice and consent frameworks, purpose limitation, minimization, these types of concepts are very commonly held. Of course, China's political and legal regime is very different from those in the European countries that now work under the GDPR. So we don't expect to see the same results, even though the influence is quite clear. If Chinese laws are influential elsewhere, we also have to look to see how they are adapted. Okay, number 2 is technical standards. There are 3 areas of concern here, and I'm just going to list them because discussing them would take too much time. But one area of concern in different countries around technical standards is if China has influence on technical standards, perhaps Chinese companies would gain commercial advantage if the standards that are adopted internationally require the use of patents that are owned by those companies. This is a classic concern in something like 5G infrastructure, and we've heard about it all over the world. Also connected to technical standards and influence in standards that get adopted are governance implications. Some standards may have more or less effect on the way that, for instance, personal data or commercial processes take place. If international standards become widely adopted, whatever gets put into them does have an implication on what is possible in other countries if they wish to be compatible. Finally, there's the question of dependency and security. If an international standard takes hold and countries are essentially required as a matter of interconnectivity to adopt certain types of technologies and certain frameworks, this could make them dependent on certain vendors from a given country, or could affect the way that their data security or other security calculus would work. Okay. Number 3. So we started with regulation itself, just the big laws, the inbound and outbound influence, technical standards. There are so many different lenses to look at, but this is an area of important research. And next we have what I'm calling vendor affordances. This is a little bit excessively academic language, I think. But what I'm thinking of here is a combination of the basic insight that in using a given technological artifact or system will bring along with it some tendencies to structure the way that people or societies or other systems act around it, simply because of the way the technology is constructed and what it makes relatively easy versus relatively difficult. I think we can think of these, what comes along with given technologies in 3 ways. One is pull factors. I mentioned this a little bit earlier with surveillance. What capabilities do countries or other actors seek when they purchase a given piece of technology? Another question is push factors. This is much more controversial, I think, and analytically difficult, because people speak about China exporting its model of digital authoritarianism is the general frame for this discussion. But to talk about exporting it, it sounds as if this is a push factor that's intentional. So we have this research question of, does China's government promote certain types of technological capabilities and affordances in the process of promoting its companies and trying to develop a strong market as a supplier of high technology? And finally, we have what I'm tentatively calling osmosis factors. This isn't about an active pull or an active push. It's just the general process that if there's a technological system that you're purchasing for some reason, and it comes with certain defaults, for instance, if your telecommunications system has built in a very robust surveillance capability, does that sort of soak into your society or your system's practices and encourage certain types of practices, which could be good or bad, of course, if the system was built depending on what your metrics of good and bad are. Okay, finally, so we've got the regulation, the technical standards, and the vendor affordances, the sort of diffusion based on the technologies that might be acquired by a major manufacturer such as China. And finally, back to the regulations. There are areas in which China is, yes, influenced by the outside world, but is also an early mover in developing and actually implementing regulations. And here I'm talking about things like the now effective since March, the algorithmic recommendation management provisions, I think is the official title. These are really, really forward-looking rules to try to regulate the way that algorithms and data-driven models are used in the market and in affecting public discourse. There are particular Chinese concerns trying to prevent mobilization against the Communist Party, but there are also very global concerns such as market fairness, things that are in front of the US Congress now, where China has gone there and actually implemented regulations. And I would argue that some aspects of those rules will probably work well, and some will probably work badly. And even though the context will be different between China and other countries, researchers and legislators should learn from what works and what doesn't, and what effects there are. So if you follow that thought, there's further areas where China is likely to be a leader, at least in terms of implementation of policy, because all of these discussions, even these algorithmic discussions, are heavily influenced in China by international scholarship and discussions. But we expect to see more on what they call deep synthesis technology. This is, deep fakes and other sort of algorithmically generated media. We're going to see efforts to regulate data use and sharing across many different sectors in the coming months and years. And I would argue here that we should have an influence from the Chinese experience because although China is different from many places, we need to pay attention elsewhere to what works and what has results that our own societies would like to see versus those that they wouldn't. Not all influence simply means adopting the other side's, the other country's practices. Some influence can be found in observing something that is going badly and trying to avoid it. Okay, so that's all I have to say for now. I really look forward to the rest of this discussion, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Graham. I think it's super important, not only what you said about the importance of the global south producing research and expanding the horizons, but also, and more specifically, what you said about the framework we can use to think about this complex issue. I really appreciate the way you framed in those four items, so to speak, the regulation itself, law shaping behavior, the technical standards, and the many different ways in which the standards are produced, and we can perceive a growing and active presence of China in different forums like ISO and others producing and shaping technical standards. I've also seen in Brazil as well, in the Brazilian Association of Technical Norms, the presence of some members of Chinese firms and researchers in which they are advancing this very technical approach of shaping standards and technical norms. And I really appreciate the two other elements you proposed for us to think. The vendor affordances, which I think also have a strong dialogue with philosophy of technology, because it is also about how technology provides new affordances and shapes behavior. So in which ways in which the Chinese government might be promoting certain types of technologies and affordances so it can also shape markets and produce behavior modification because of the effects that the technology produces. And also this very dynamic and almost biological approach, I would say, of the osmosis factor, understanding the pull factors, the push factors, the dynamics of markets, and the different forms in which they constitute and the multiple relations that we have. I think it's super comprehensive and super useful for us to advance the conversation. I will also say, before passing to Lucas, so he can also have a dialogue with all of you, that 6 months ago, when we began this research, we were also interested in understanding if the Chinese government was competing with the European Union in the approach that the Union also always had to promote itself as a political community, as a big exporter of legal frameworks. And there are a lot of empirical research by many researchers at Florence and other research centers like Agustin Rossi or Ben Wagner and others, showing that this is something that is structured as a policy as well for foreign relations. So members of the European Commission or European Union, they are sent to Brazil and other countries to talk about the European approach of regulation or data protection or other forms of regulation, and they try to advance that also as a strategy of diplomacy or cultural influence of a European model of organization of society and law and technology. And we were concerned about that. Is China somehow also trying to compete and to overcome this duality between the US and Europe? But I will pass to Lucas because what we found, it's not so simple as that. We could not find strong proxies or evidences that this is occurring, but we were puzzled by other things that might be occurring that we can try to theorize once we have more advanced and more data. So, Lucas, I'll give it to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rafael. First of all, of course, I would like to thank everyone for attending this event, especially our guests. Graham was very kind to accept the invitation upon his return to work. Great to hear his speech today and the whole framework that Graham presented. I think it's going to be really useful for future research, especially in data privacy Brazil. Sophia and Parsifal also accept our invitation and receive the report in such a short time. Thank you so much for being here. And I need also to thank the team of Data Privacy Brazil that have done an amazing job around this project. So I think we need to repeat, as Rafael already stated, that this report is an exploratory work. It's still in progress. So it's the result of a short-term project funded by Doublethink Lab through the China and the World Community Fund. And it brings with it all the limitations of a work produced in 3 months a time to gather the data and to study the data later. So there are limits, of course, particularly in the literature review and in the attempts to expand the number of interviews. So I'm going to make just a brief presentation of the report in the following minutes. As we presented in the invitation for this workshop, and Rafael also repeated in the beginning, quite frequently the literature on this topic works with a distinction between these 2 different models of regulation on data protection and digital rights. European model on the one side, and an American model on the other side. So the first one seen as centered on dignity and fundamental rights and general law, as opposed to another one based on innovation, consumer welfare, and fragmented legislation. What is different here? Our take in this project is that this binary split is not enough given the diversity of regulatory models in the global south, and especially China's growing influence in the debate on how new markets regulate personal data. This research aims to understand and to analyze the growing Chinese influence in the field of regulation of digital markets and in the export of regulatory standards on technology and society issues. Our goal since the beginning was to promote an investigation into the main features of strategies and regulatory standards designed in China and the possible process of direct and indirect influence, as Graham somewhat mentioned. So it's a 2-way analysis here of the influence of this process in peripheral countries such as Brazil, questioning, of course, the presence of Chinese technology companies in the country and their strategies of incidence here. For that, we decided for a multi-method approach in several different steps. First, we assessed data on the flow, public data on the flow of international trade and foreign investment between Brazil and China, looking mainly here for the importance of the ICT and digital sectors in the trade balance. Second, we mapped technology and society laws and bills in both China and Brazil. Then we advanced to conduct exploratory interviews with technology experts from multiple sectors, investigating and questioning our initial hypotheses that I already presented to you as well. And fourth, from the available public data, we tried to map the flow of public officials and congressmen between Brazil and China in the last 5 years in a way to try to capture, possible influences of Chinese regulation on technology regulatory initiatives in Brazil. So again, we are working with this two-way of influence, both from China and from Brazil, on both sides. And finally, we decided to research the news published in the last 5 years in newspapers with wide national circulation, again in an attempt to map the public debate echoed through the media, actually, identify manifestations of public and private agents, and follow, of course, the development of the main policies on the matter. So with this raw data collected, we started to organize information and trying to build some lines of thought around them. In general, and with that, I began to present some of our findings. What we noticed was a more complex, a more opaque, a more distinct process on how China exerts its influence to regulate new data and technology-intensive markets. And quickly, I want to share some of the findings around these issues. First, in common among the interviews, there is a conclusion about the difficulty in assessing China's influence on the design of regulatory standards in third states. Of course, methodologically speaking, it's really difficult to do that in a very precise way. And at the same time, through the interviews, the export of regulation is not seen by the respondents as the main driver of China's advocacy strategy in Brazil, with a certain difficulty in identifying China's lobbying policy here. Second, based on data of travel by public officials and congressmen to China, it is clear the greater importance of issues related to infrastructure and telecommunications, especially around the implementation of 5G networks in the country, with emphasis on relations above all with Huawei, and to a lesser extent also to ZTE. And third, in the chosen period, so in the last 5 years, 129 news articles on China were selected to be analyzed in detail. And as Graham just mentioned before, of these 129 news articles, just over a third reproduce or reflects foreign media, so echoing global discussions on issues related to China, mainly from an American or a European perspective. As well, in considering the news still, as well as in the other methods adopted through the research in newspapers, the issue related to development of 5G technology and the role of Huawei in Brazil was definitely the most recurrent theme. Most of the time, presented as a national security issue by President Bolsonaro's staff. So echoing this alignment, clear alignment between the Brazilian leader and the former US President Donald Trump. What brought several times to the public debate the ambassador of China in Brazil trying to react directly to American pressures on Brazil regarding the adoption of Chinese technology. So this whole research and this whole set of data lead us to some preliminary conclusions that I want to share with you, and with this also end my presentation and open the floor to Sophia and Parsifal. And the first one is that, in general, from the data that we have, that we collected, of course, we have this limit, The research showed the lack of traditional methods of lobbying by China, considering our research topic. So in Brazil, it was not possible to notice either directly or indirectly Chinese influence on the first two legislations on the matter, the Marco Civil da Internet and the Brazilian Data Protection Law. However, the facial recognition bill presented to the Congress in 2 years ago, I think 2 or 3 years ago, appears to have taken advantage of the Chinese experience, but we don't know precisely how. Trips to China and statements by congressmen linked to the initiative attest to the inspiration in Chinese surveillance strategies and models, but we don't know precisely how both are related. And regarding another project in progress, very important in this field of technology, the AI bill presented on this year, more precise data are lacking. We didn't have the chance to talk with people related to this bill and get more information on that. But at the same time, it's clear the consolidated presence of Huawei in Brazil and the fundamental participation of this company in the ICT infrastructure in the country. Huawei already participates in about 50% of the telecommunications infrastructure in Brazil. And this leads us to another conclusion, that the technical standards of 5G technology seem to be imposed by the established dependence on the Chinese system and supported at the same time by the Brazilian telecommunications companies. So these are the main conclusions that we achieved through this research. We like to thank again for your attention, and we hope that this report may be useful to other research, and it will be great to hear Sophia and Parsifal's comments on it.
Great, thank you, Lucas. So I will begin with Sophia and ask you, Sophia, if you could also share some of your perspectives as a researcher doing the job you've been doing at Real, also with the BRICS project and many others, which are also looking to China, and to ask you to blend your perspective with also some of the insights provided by Graham and Lucas. And thank you very much for participating, Sophia.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very humbled by the invitation after I saw everybody who was joining in the conversation. So a little bit about the study. First of all, I love how you structured the initial research. I think it's very, the types of information that you decided to analyze and how it connects to a larger geopolitical context. When I think about China regulating and how it might influence, I think it's important to understand how China regulates considering the Chinese context. And it goes like with what Graham said at the beginning in his introductory speech, like we have to see what works for them, and then we have to see why it worked and what didn't work, and then what may work for Brazil. And like Lucas said in the end, the draft bill for AI, for example, although there is no direct link yet or information, it's not very clear if the congressmen or the lobbyists were influenced, but when they opened the floor for the legal academics to talk about it and discuss the bill, Luca from the CyberBRICS project already mentioned that it would be interesting to look at how China is dealing with the governance of artificial intelligence and how it is regulating through some specific uses of artificial intelligence, like the algorithm recommendation provisions that Graham mentioned. So it would be interesting to, I think the push that I'm mostly seeing comes from academics, because it's still very vague and dark. We need somebody to pull the information out of China, present it to the Brazilian people and audience, but we have to present it with the context of the Chinese government and legal regime, which is something that is very difficult to do, like Graham put in the beginning, and see what works and compare it to the Brazilian legal system and the Brazilian society and its needs, because Education is different, culture is different, how people deal with technology and the digitization of services, everything is evolving in very different speeds and ways. So we can't just necessarily, I'm going to copy this and put it here. But my main interest as a researcher is analyzing that. And I can see, like Graham said, that China has been consolidating a lot in terms of digital policies. It has evolved so much in the last 10 years. And they're ahead in some topics that are becoming topics of concern in Brazil, especially when it comes to minors, digital influencers, online addiction, online gaming addiction. These are all issues that are starting to be more frequent in the Brazilian newspaper headlines, and there is nothing regulating it directly. We have the statute protecting children and teenagers, we have the civil code, but there is no direct regulation about these matters yet. And as a researcher, my interest is trying to see what can be brought into the Brazilian and also spark this discussion. So it's very important, the study that Data Privacy Brazil is doing and this conversation right here. So these are my initial remarks.
That's great, Sophia. Thank you. And fully agree with your perspective that we lack some of the intermediaries or brokers to properly access what is going on in China. Probably the academics are doing that, but we do not see those brokers or intermediaries in the same way that we see with some other big techs from the US or other policy analysts. That's why also the work of Graham is so important, in which we can find good translations and materials that can be accessed to have a better discussion. And I will ask Parsival, you also have a great experience working with the Sino and Latin American relations, a lot of work also done in Venezuela. I would kindly ask you to also share your perspective from your experience as a research and policy analyst of those complex relationships, and also your reactions to what Graham and Lucas and Sophia said. And thank you for joining.
Rafael, thank you so much, and well, everyone at Data Privacy Brazil for organizing this. It's my great pleasure to be here. Well, to be honest, my own area of expertise, the research I've done and the research we do at our research center is not that focused on analyzing regulations and the exports of technology and implementation of particularly of Chinese technology, especially in the telecommunications industry. Our work has mostly been focused on the analyzing China's discourse. Primarily, it's diplomatic discourse, especially using online social media. And this has given us a glimpse into what type of narratives they're pushing. And through that, we're able to have an idea of what are their interests throughout the region, and also divided by country, because while you do see a general discourse that is directed at Latin America as a whole, within the global south, you also do see differences between how they talk to local audiences, depending in which country we are. And I think that speaks a lot to what the learning process and the level of engagement and of local knowledge that they have acquired over the last 10, 15 years. If you look back to the beginning of the 2000s, most ambassadors and consuls in the region couldn't speak Spanish or Portuguese. It wasn't that sophisticated. Fast forward to 2022, especially in the midst of a post-pandemic, the scenario is completely different. And I think it speaks to a lot of the points that my colleagues here have pointed out, because It is a given lack of access to information. It's quite complicated, which is one of the reasons we try to focus on the Latin American perspective. It's because you do have more data to actually work with, and in a sense, it also helps measure to a degree how it's being perceived on this side of the ocean, and how different constituencies are reacting to, be it the Chinese government's participation or the participation of Chinese companies in the region. So I'll leave it at that. I can comment further on what we've actually learned from analyzing all this discourse, and I have a couple of comments specific to Brazil, given well, the huge role it plays not only in regional politics, but also China's interests, particular interests in Brazil.
All right, great. Graham, do you want to jump into or react anyhow with some of the points raised by Lucas or Sophia or Parsifal?
I don't have anything sharp to say right now, so maybe I'll wait until the next round comes.
All right. We have, I'll ask you all, because some people are also making some compliments to the research conducted and saying hi here on the YouTube. You can also make a question. Carolina just made one, so I'll read it here and just put it to you. What is the outlook for civil liability for damages caused by acts in violation of data protection regulations? What is CCP and academics' position on this matter? I think maybe this might be one that you might answer, Sophia. Not sure, but I thought of you, because it's really specific also with the approach and the enactment of the data protection law in China and the discussions about the civil liability model. Do you have that answer?
I can start, but I hope Graham and the rest of the team can complement me. But I think it was a discussion that I had with a colleague from Peking University, because he said that companies were having a very difficult time finding a data protection officer because of the amount of responsibility and potential direct liability they have when it comes to any incident or something. And also the responsibility overall of the companies for violations. So it's not just reputational, it's also financial, and it's personal to whoever is in charge, depending on the context. So I think we are observing, we're studying this, and we notice this trend, like when it comes to hiring DPOs, and we notice these issues. But then I spoke to some other colleagues, and they said, oh, we're doing via law firm or something, appointing somebody, and then somebody eventually joins the company. I don't have any final ideas or thoughts on this. I'm just observing because it's something that is new. Just like the Brazilian data protection law, we're still trying to see how the authority will interpret and apply, and how it will consider the level of damages that is being caused by any violations, because is the mere breach of personal data, is it exposing personal data a breach? Is it necessarily going to cause harm? So I think it relates to like major questions that all data protection laws have in common. Like you have to analyze the case, you have to analyze the impact. So I'll leave it at that, and then Graham can fill in if he wants to.
Yeah, well, I'll just say a couple of things. I don't have an answer personally on whether there's a framework for civil liability where a person who's been harmed can bring action directly against the folks who've caused the harm. I think there may be something there under the civil code, but this is an area where I'm not especially confident. What I can say, reflecting what Sophia was mentioning, is that in the personal information protection law, there are numerous provisions for liability for violation of the various parts of the law. And they apply, as she said, both to the companies, or the personal information handler, as we translate it, or processor, and as some others will say. So that would be the company, and then also the person responsible for various roles, and that's where it really does get into individual responsibility. But I could be wrong, but my general view impression is that the law is constructed such that individuals have certain rights. They can demand that, for instance, data be corrected or deleted. However, they don't necessarily, in this law at least, have the right to sue over a violation of it. Instead, if the personal information handler has failed to perform its duties under the law, then meaning violating that right that is enumerated for the personal information subject, then presumably the regulator would come and assess administrative penalties and especially fines. And the last thing I'll say is that, as with most Chinese laws, there is one of these provisions that if the conduct is criminal, then it will be investigated as such. And so there always is another avenue, and this is where my own research lens on Chinese law is limited, because I focus on everything digital, and I rely on colleagues and both inside and outside China to understand how it all connects on a deeper level. But yeah.
All right, thanks for answering. Let me connect and also give it to Parzival and Lucas this question by Jacqueline about how this new approach might be affected by multilateral trade agreements that China is adhering to, such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. So also a question about how the digital trade agenda in many forums might affect what China can do, but also, on the other hand, how China is also influencing and participating and trying to shape those spaces as well. So, Lucas and Parzival, any ideas or comments on this particular phenomenon?
I'd like to make a short comment on the topic that Sophia and Graham were pointing to, but from a hardware perspective. We're currently conducting some research on Huawei's hardware, and basically, why do Latin American operators choose Huawei over their competitors? And even though we're still in the midst of the research, but some of the preliminary findings point to the quality of the service. Within the telecommunications industry, the most important thing is the uptime, so that no links are actually down, because that transfers into lost millions of dollars lost just for a link coming down in a particular time for a long period. So the thing with Huawei is that because it lacks the bureaucracy and the internal regulations to address this kind of hardware malfunctions, there is a lot of leeway given to the technician that's actually accessing the hardware to figure out what's going on, and the most important thing is being done from China. So probably there will be a Chinese technician in Shenzhen accessing a router in some city, rural area somewhere in Latin America, and since he has direct access, it's very easy for him to see what the problem is, get the link up as fast as possible. Huawei's competitors, on the other hand, have to actually go through a series of steps of approval for a technician to actually have access to this router or to the specific link. So there is a competitive advantage in terms of services. So they're faster, and let's just say there's less bureaucracy. How does that translate it into a problem? So the moment that a foreign technician has access to that link, everything that goes through it is, for play. And how can you actually implement any type of regulation over this? It's not a problem of Huawei. It's a problem of the industry, because other service providers and other hardware manufacturers also have this problem. It's just a matter of how to mitigate it, because they all solve the problem the same way. It's just a matter of the provider and the hardware manufacturer, on the other hand, to mitigate these the possibilities of there being a data breach. But in terms of how to actually monitor this, it's extremely complicated because of the technology. So it's not a Huawei thing; it's an industry thing.
So just a quick words about the digital trade agenda. I can say that the role of China in the digital trade agenda, especially trying to join the TPP, I think this is the novelty here. This in some way attests the willingness of China to participate in global data flow debates. But at the same time, it will put China in a position quite similar, I think, to Canada and Brazil as well, because puts China just between a difficult balance between a liberal stance on digital trade inspired by a North American big tech position and a more protective stance on data protection. So I think I'm really skeptical about that, especially a Chinese entry in TPP.
If I can jump in, I think a lot of the concerns about CPTPP were about the data localization requirements that derived from the cybersecurity law. Like, it meant a barrier to free market and exchange or something, but in practice, what we see is that exchanging data and transferring data abroad is possible if you follow the procedures. It's just, the problem is that the procedures have not been very clear until very recently, when they started drafting the measures for security assessments and outbound data transfers. So in practice, before PIPL and the data security law and these measures for the security assessment, what people did was, let's notify the Cyber Security Administration of China that we might transfer data. So it was like a case-by-case analysis, but I know for a fact that it's not you're forbidden of transferring data abroad. I think that's a big misconception, and people think that it's going to be a barrier for them to join. I think the problem is that you have to assess if exchanging data with China is too costly and may impact the market and the trade agreements or not. So I think there's also this concern.
I'll just add one note on that. In both the personal information protection law and the data security law, there are provisions that say if the People's Republic of China enters into treaties or international agreements, then those provisions shall apply. So they have these frameworks that may be in conflict with, with the existing structures of CPTPP or other things like that. But at least for certain aspects of the laws that are most problematic from a perspective of international trade agreements, they have written in this plan. It's in there, and it's sort of, I view it as a declared intention to be open to negotiate some of these terms. I would expect, however, that the Chinese negotiators would be very tough, and they would seek preferential conditions for joining. Just look at the absolutely painstaking process that the Chinese and U.S. representatives went through on WTO accession over 20 years ago. I would expect it's going to be very tough, and I agree that the prospects for China joining CPTPP are not, well, it wouldn't be easy. It's not impossible, but it's certainly not something that I would expect to happen very quickly.
Great. Parzival, you said you had spared some comments about the Brazilian perspective from your view If you want to share that now, I think it's super fine.
Sure. So about a month ago, we published a database. I'll share the link with the audience afterwards. So this database is a collection of all the data, all the tweets published by Chinese by 4 types of accounts. So the Chinese embassy, ambassador, consulate, and consul throughout Latin America. So in this database, you're able to search by account and then see a detailed analysis of all the content. So who they follow, number of followers, hashtags, connections between the accounts, which and then a qualitative analysis of the content. And if you want, you can actually also compare accounts to see their level of activity, and then it's basically a tool for researchers like us, and well, anyone who's interested in knowing about what messages Chinese officials are trying to push. And in the case of Brazil, it was quite interesting because especially throughout 2020, because you do see these peaks of activity, especially around November, which was the run-up to the US election. And when you see who these accounts are interacting with, there's a lot of interaction with Brazilian politicians. This is not something common throughout the rest of the region. It's usually a more one-way communication that they just transmit a message. But in Brazil's case, it's interesting because there was a lot of back and forth. Well, especially with accounts, be it of Jair Bolsonaro or his cabinet, and there was this back and forth that went on for like around a month. And obviously, there was a lot of mention about the talking points of then President Donald Trump and some of particular Republican senators. So that speaks to the level of reactiveness of Chinese politicians. They usually transmit a message, but when there are key issues that they're interested in or that they feel attacked for whatever reason, there's always a pushback. And you see this very clearly in the Brazilian case. And it's funny because then you move on to 2021, election's over, the level of rhetoric from the Brazilian administration toned down, and then things went back to quote unquote normal, which is that more one-way communication. And in Brazil, the topic of Huawei is actually one of the most active ones. So the use of the hashtag, be it Huawei, 5G technology. So that speaks to the China's and Chinese companies' interests in Brazil are very technologically focused, especially in the telecommunications industry.
That's really interesting, Parsival. I would be great if you could share the database as well. I think it's an extremely useful resource for researchers. And indeed, we had a lot of fights through Twitter back then, I remember. And also, Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, is constantly reacting to ambassadors. And it always, I'm also puzzled by the fact that the Chinese government representatives, they're also very active and also very sharp on what they're saying on Twitter. We also had that effect in the period of the vaccines, and I think it was very clear that Chinese government were acting together with João Doria, who was the governor of São Paulo, who had a big campaign, who was the first state to develop a campaign for vaccination through partnerships, while Bolsonaro at the federal government was developing an anti-vaccination campaign, so to speak. He was not mobilizing the government properly. for vaccines. So this all we're also in the big puzzle.
Yeah, and the consul, the Chinese consul in Rio de Janeiro at the time, he was always actually promoting or retweeting the governor's tweets and that spat with the central government. They were very in tandem when talking about vaccines and all these, well, the first contracts that they signed with Sinovac to distribute vaccines in Sao Paulo and Rio. Sorry, I put the link on the private chat. I don't know if you can put it afterwards on the general chat.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'll ask the team to put on the screen if it's possible. So we're going to the end, and before passing to you for a final round of the importance of more research or the preliminary findings we've had so far, I would like to also point, and this was something very curious that we learned through the research, right, Lucas, which was the emerging conflict around the Asian e-commerce platforms. In many interviews, when we were asking about what the interviewees thought about policy issues on technology and regulation or the AI or data protection, some of them reacted like, oh, forget about it. The big conflict right now, it's about e-commerce and e-commerce platform because of the success of Shopee, AliExpress, and other who are really like breaking down the competitors, and Mercado Livre and Magazine Luiza, the big national players or Argentinian players, are decreasing the capacity to sell products in the model which was called camelô digital, which is an expression in Portuguese when you have like a small business and you sell cheap things, because there is a tax benefit. If you sell something for less than $50 in those markets, you're not taxed when you're selling the product. So there was this big campaign and also open letters and movement by Luciano Hung, who's a businessman. He owns a big firm called Avan. Luciano Hung is also a big supporter of the federal government of Jair Bolsonaro, always using like white and yellow suits, extravagant clothing. But he actually had a meeting with the Ministry of Economy, together with many representatives of the main associations of e-commerce in Brazil, the Brazilian ones, to defend the taxation model and saying that it was necessary to reform law so those emerging e-commerce platforms could be taxed. And I think this was also learning from the project, right, Lucas, in kind of a movement of the technological and regulation debate towards a more specific taxation issue, an issue of equality that they were posing, that they should be taxed the same, also trying to raise the institutional costs and obstacles so that those firms could not be as efficient as they could, or enlarge the group of consumers they have. Because what was interesting to observe was that in one day in which the government announced that they were going to do that, in the other day there was an open letter on the internet with like 100,000 signatures saying that the government should not tax those platforms, should not intervene in the emergency of those e-commerce platforms. And the federal government stepped back. Bolsonaro probably did a political calculation that it was not feasible for him to go to that fight, considering the massive amount of sellers. We're talking about more than 2 million sellers using those platforms, which could be angry with the government, and that would reduce the incentives to vote for them in the election. So it's a quite complex phenomenon as well, this intersection between politics, real politics, incentives for voting, the mobilization of different interested groups, and how regulation is shaped in practice. Well, so I'll pass for you for your final remarks, beginning with Graham, and then Sophia, Lucas, and Parsival.
Okay, well, thanks again. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and you know what you just mentioned, Rafael, about the the focus on e-commerce is, to me, one of the most fascinating areas now, because it's absolutely global. It's sort of simultaneously happening in many different markets, where there's this power struggle between the large platforms on which communication and commerce takes place, and various governments and societies are trying to figure out how to rebalance the power structure. And we're seeing this on the Chinese side, and in the Chinese context, we're seeing this evolve very rapidly, and it's quite unclear exactly where it's going to turn out, because it's I think another area of where China could be in a first mover position in beginning to write down very detailed platform regulations under a framework called categorized and graded regulation, where you sort of split out each different platform by what type it is and by its sort of scale and importance to social and national security implications. It's first mover in a sense that if they actually go through with this framework, this implies that there will be different regulatory frameworks for dozens, if not hundreds, of types of platforms, which to me sounds absolutely crazy. I think it will be an enormous pain in the ass for anybody doing business. It will be an enormous pain in the ass for actual government officials who have to regulate these things. But this is the stated intention. Although I think it sounds like a pain, obviously there is some value in adapting the regulations to the specific conditions of which industry, which function the platform has, and how big or how crucial it is to social and security goals. So I just wanted to bring that up and mention that I think this is an area where we should be watching what happens in China, because to me, as I said, it sounds wild and perhaps chaotic and maybe impossible. But it seems like they're going to try it. And some of it might work and some of it might fail. And I think we can learn a lot around the world, as certainly there's a huge fight going in the United States over so-called monopoly-related regulation that will go not very far if it even passes. But anyway, so I'll end there, and thanks again. I look forward to learning more from the research in the Brazilian case as it moves forward, and congratulations on this very thoughtful opening to that research project.
Thank you so much, Braham. Sophia?
Thank you. I think to build up on what you said, Rafael, and what Braham said, I think the e-commerce initiatives, regulation initiatives are very interesting to see, because the way that it is in China, it has entered every aspect of people's social lives even. So it also not only became a matter of regulating platforms, but also regulating behavior on these platforms, and the people they're mostly selling these products and how they also present themselves in their personal accounts or something. So I also agree that it's insane for whoever wants to do business, and it's going to be insane for whoever wants to study and keep track of what is happening to see what may be a good idea to try and bring to Brazilian lobbyists and congressmen or not. And overall, regarding the whole study and discussion, I think it was very rich conversation. I learned a lot. I'm very happy to be here. And I think that how the research is structured is very interesting, because I always see how China regulates. It's got a little bit of push and pull. It invests, and it has like a commercial influence. It has like a political influence, and then little by little, certain aspects of how they regulate their scenarios may impact Brazil. So like Percival said, regarding the structure of how telecoms are operating, or even if e-commerce companies from China decide to perpetrate the Brazilian market and bring their practices, and they're already functioning something, and there's this legal gap in Brazil, just assume there is a legal gap in Brazil, and how they may influence, because the consumers will get used to a model, and it will be very hard to dictate otherwise and shape everything. So this is a very interesting study, and I want to see what you come up with next. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Lucas, I'll pass to you and then to Parsival.
Okay, thank you, Rafael. I just want to thanks again the kindness of Graham, Sophie, and Parsival to be here with us today. Also to stress that maybe in the future research, Rafael, we can take advantage of the framework proposed by Graham. I think it's really great. And also, as suggested by Sophia, maybe invest more efforts on researching the participation of Brazilian academics and their openness to Chinese experience as well. Also, Parsival just presented us with the platform that he and his team organized. I think it's dialogues a lot with our findings, so it's going to be useful as well. So thank you so much for being here, and thanks again, Rafael, for the whole project.
Thanks, Lucas and Parsival.
Well, as everyone else, thank you so much for the invitation. It's always useful to share ideas and know what people like yourselves are working on. I would just comment that yeah, we have some crazy times ahead of us, and in terms of like regulations, obviously we cannot, Latin America, we usually use that all-encompassing tag, but we do know there are some stark differences. It's not the same to talk about data privacy issues in Venezuela and in Nicaragua than in Brazil or Chile. So I would keep my eye out for Brazil and Mexico for obvious reasons, largest markets. So these are probably the places where Chinese e-platforms and tech companies are going to be digging in hard. And well, that's very the only thing they have in common is the largest markets, but Mexico is highly influenced by the United States, so the results will be different. But in Brazil's case, I think it's going to be a very cutthroat, and it's going to be in the frontier of all these negotiations. So, well, thanks again, everyone, for having me.
Thanks a lot. And I want to make a special thanks for a really bright researcher of our team, who is Michael Servilia. He dedicated himself strongly to the whole project since last year in the China Index project, and now with this research. So Michael, he's in the back room, not appearing here, but he's a key person also in this research. The research will be published once we have a second round of discussions internally. It will go through more comments and more refinement. It is still a draft paper, but we hope to get it published in the next 2 months. And we will also, we're organizing an international seminar on democracy and data protection that will probably happen in November in Sao Paulo. We will make the proper invitation to all of you once we have the final details. Probably this could be a subject matter that we can discuss as well in this international seminar. And we'll all keep in touch so we can advance the conversation. But I want to truly thank you in the name of the NGO, because it was extremely insightful conversation. I also learned a lot. I believe that the people who were here watching us, going through the language barrier and considering that we're doing it in English, also took a lot of advantage of it. And I want to thank you all for joining us and wish you a great day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.